For 6 years, an elderly black woman raised her maid's orphaned son as her own, with nothing but a prayer. Then one day, a fleet of black cars rolled onto her narrow street. A man in a navy suit stepped out, holding documents. He wasn't there to take the boy, both parents were dead. He was there because a grandfather the boy had never met had been searching for over half a decade, and what that grandfather had for the child would change everything she thought she knew. But first, the man would ask one question that would shatter her world. Her name is Miss Clara. She's 72 years old, living on Social Security in a cramped row house. 6 years ago, her housekeeper died, leaving behind a newborn boy no one in the family wanted. Miss Clara took him in without a second thought, fed him, clothed him, loved him like her own. But she has no legal custody, no rights. And the man walking up her porch steps represents a grandfather who's been searching for that child since the day he was born. What that grandfather has to say will force Miss Clara to make the hardest decision of her life. To understand what was happening on that porch, you have to go back 6 years. To a winter night in 2018, when a woman named Rosa Jones died in a charity ward, leaving behind a baby boy no one had ever seen. Rosa had been Miss Clara's housekeeper. A quiet young woman from Mississippi who came to Chicago looking for work, stayed quiet, did her job, never missed a day. When she stopped showing up, Miss Clara called the number Rosa had left. No answer. She called hospitals until she found one that had a Jane Doe matching Rosa's description. Rosa had been in a car accident, no ID, no family listed, no emergency contact. By the time Miss Clara got to the hospital, Rosa was already gone. A nurse handed her a small bundle. Boy maybe 3 weeks old. Rosa had given birth alone, no father on the birth certificate, no next of kin. The baby had no name, no home, no one to claim him. Child Protective Services was already on the way. Miss Clara looked at that child, a tiny brown face in a hospital blanket, and she made a decision that would alter the course of her life. She told the nurse she was the grandmother. It wasn't true, but it was the only thing she could think of to keep the baby out of the system. A system she knew too well. Miss Clara had lost a son to foster care 30 years earlier, a wound that had never healed. She wasn't about to let another black boy disappear into that same machine. The hospital didn't check. The baby was discharged into her arms. She named him Jordan, and for the next 6 years, Miss Clara raised him in that cramped row house on a fixed income that barely covered her own meals. She cut cable, stopped buying new shoes, stretched every dollar until it screamed. Jordan grew up on hand-me-downs and home-cooked beans, on bedtime stories told in the dark when the electricity got cut, on a love so fierce it held that little house together like mortar between bricks. Miss Clara never filed for legal guardianship. She didn't have money for a lawyer. She didn't trust the courts. She figured if no one came looking, she could just keep loving Jordan until he turned 18. And for 6 years, no one did come. But here, what Miss Clara didn't know, Rosa had kept a secret. The boy had a father she'd never spoken about, a man who had died 2 months before Jordan was born, a man whose own father had been searching for any trace of his dead son's child since the day he heard Rosa was pregnant. That grandfather was Thomas Vance, a name Miss Clara had never heard, a name that carried weight in boardrooms across 3 continents. And the man in the navy suit walking up her steps was his attorney. He'd found them. After 6 years, tens of thousands of dollars in private investigators, and a trail that dead-ended again and again until a hospital record finally surfaced, he found them. Miss Clara stood on that porch holding Jordan tight as the man climbed the steps. He wasn't cruel. He was professional. He offered a small, tight smile and introduced himself. Then he said the words that made Miss Clara's knees buckle. Mr. Vance has been looking for his grandson for a very long time. He wants to meet him. He wants to provide for him. And ma'am, he has the legal right to do exactly that. Miss Clara felt the world tilt. Her fingers tightened around Jordan's shoulders. For 6 years, she had feared this exact moment, a knock at the door, a stranger with papers, the threat of losing the only child she had left to love. The attorney introduced himself as David Langston, a partner at a firm that handled estates for families whose names rarely appeared in the news but whose money moved in silence. He handed her a business card embossed in gold. Mr. Vance does not want to cause you distress, ma'am. He only learned of your existence yesterday. He asked me to explain everything before anything else happens. May I come inside? Miss Clara hesitated. She looked down at Jordan, who was staring at the strange man with wide, unblinking eyes. The boy didn't know this world. He only knew the cracked linoleum floor of their kitchen, the church fans they used when the air conditioner broke, the way Miss Clara hummed gospel songs while she cooked beans. She nodded and led them inside. The living room was small, every surface covered with the photographs of a life lived frugally. Langston sat on the edge of a plastic-covered sofa. Jordan pressed himself against Miss Clara's side. Langston opened his briefcase and took out a photograph. It showed a young man, smiling, maybe 25, with a face that made Jordan gasp. The eyes, the jawline, the slope of the shoulders. It was a mirror of the boy sitting in front of him. "This is your father," Langston said to Jordan. "His name was Marcus Vance. He died 6 years ago, 2 months before you were born." Jordan looked at the picture, then up at Miss Clara. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He had asked about his father before, begged her to tell him something, anything. She had always said she didn't know. That had been the truth, until now. Langston's voice remained steady, the calm delivery of a man who had presented devastating information to families 100 times. Marcus was an only child. His mother died when he was young. His father, Thomas Vance, raised him alone. When Marcus died, it shattered Thomas completely. He nearly lost the will to keep living. Then Langston paused, and the room seemed to contract. Marcus was also the sole heir to the Vance family trust, and now, by right of blood, that inheritance passes to his only living child, Jordan. Miss Clara's mind raced. She had never heard of Thomas Vance. She had never considered that Jordan might be connected to wealth. Rosa had come to her door 6 years earlier wearing a thin coat and carrying nothing but a baby's bottle and a single change of clothes. The idea that this child, who had worn hand-me-down sneakers and eaten free school lunches, was the heir to some dynasty, felt like a cruel joke. But Langston was not joking. He slid a financial disclosure across the coffee table, and the numbers were so large Miss Clara's eyes could not hold them. The Vance family had built a shipping empire out of New Orleans, a conglomerate that moved cargo across the Gulf and into Latin America. The estimated net worth, conservatively, was north of $300 million. And then Langston delivered the line that cut through Miss Clara's chest like a blade. "Mr. Vance wants to meet his grandson. He wants to provide for him. And given that you have no legal custody, no biological relationship, and no court order recognizing your guardianship, he is within his rights to petition for full custody immediately." He did not say it cruelly. He said it like a man statting the weather. Miss Clara's hands began to shake. She had known the law was not on her side. She had hidden from it for 6 years, praying no one would look. Now the law was sitting on her plastic-covered sofa, wearing a $10,000 suit. "Why did Rosa tell me about this man?" Miss Clara asked. The question came out sharper than she intended. Langston's face softened just slightly. Rosa and Marcus were estranged. They met at a college party, fell in love quickly, but when Rosa became pregnant, Thomas Vance objected. He did not believe the child was his son's. He cut them off. Rosa disappeared. She never told anyone where she went, and by the time Marcus realized the truth, he was already dying from a heart condition no one had detected. Rosa chose to keep Jordan hidden from the Vance family. She believed she was protecting him, so that was it. Rosa had run from this wealth, this power, this family that had rejected her, and now the very family she had fled was coming to claim the child she had left behind. Miss Clara looked at Jordan. He was staring at the financial paper, the photograph, the strange man with his gold watch and his careful words. He was 8 years old, and his world was cracking open like a dry riverbed. Langston made an offer then, one that sounded generous, but carried an unspoken ultimatum. Mr. Vance was an old man, in fragile health, and he wanted to spend whatever time he had left getting to know his grandson. He would establish a full trust for Jordan, education, medical care, a future that Miss Clara could never provide on a fixed income. He was willing to let Miss Clara remain in Jordan's life, visit, even continue to be called Grandma if she cooperated. But if she resisted, if she tried to fight in court, the Vance legal team would move to sever any informal bond. She would lose quickly and finally, and Jordan would be taken anyway. Miss Clara asked for time. She asked for one night to think. Langston agreed, but as he stood to leave, he said something that made her blood run cold. "Ma'am, there is something else. Because of the way Rosa concealed the pregnancy, and because the hospital record lists you as claiming Jordan under false pretenses, a mandatory report has already been filed with Child Protective Services. They will likely be here within the next 24 hours. I am not your enemy. The system that is now involved will not be as patient as I am." He walked out. The door clicked shut. Outside, the black cars still lined the street, engines running, a quiet army of privilege parked in front of a house that had never known any. Miss Clara held Jordan tight and began to pray, but before she could finish, a second knock came, harder, more official, and through the frosted glass of the front door, she could see the silhouette of a uniform, a clipboard, and a badge. The state had arrived. Miss Clara opened the door. Two women stood in the cold, one holding a clipboard, the other with a badge clipped to her belt. They introduced themselves as Child Protective Services investigators. The older one, a woman with tired eyes named Ms. Patterson, said they had received a mandatory report concerning a child in her care, Jordan. She stated that Miss Clara had no biological or legal relationship to the boy, and that the initial hospital discharge 6 years earlier had been obtained under false pretenses. She was polite. She was also unmovable. "We need to speak with Jordan privately, and depending on that conversation, we may need to place him in an emergency foster home tonight while we sort out the legal status." Jordan was in the kitchen, still gripping the photograph of his father. When the investigators knelt down and started asking him questions, soft, careful questions about who fed him, who tucked him in, whether he felt safe, he looked at Miss Clara with a terror she had not seen since the night she first held him in that hospital. She wanted to scream, to snatch him back, to bar the door and call the church ladies to form a human wall. But she was 72 years old, a black woman with no lawyer, facing a system that had swallowed children whole for less. So she sat on the plastic-covered sofa with her hands balled into fists and prayed silently while a government worker decided whether her son was still hers. After 20 minutes, Ms. Patterson stood up. She said the home was clean, the boy was healthy, and there was no evidence of abuse. But the law was the law. Miss Clara had no standing, and because the Vance family's legal team had already flagged the case, the agency had no choice but to open a formal investigation. Jordan would have to be placed in temporary foster care for 72 hours while the court determined jurisdiction. "I'm sorry," Ms. Patterson said, and she meant it. Then she took Jordan by the hand and led him out the front door into a waiting sedan. Jordan didn't cry. He just looked back at Miss Clara with an expression that said, "I trusted you to protect me, and you couldn't." The door closed. The car pulled away. Miss Clara fell to her knees on that worn linoleum and let out a sound that was not a scream and not a prayer, but something in between. She didn't sleep. She sat in the empty bedroom where Jordan's drawings still covered the wall, stick figures of a tall woman and a small boy holding hands, and she replayed every decision she had made for 6 years. Should she have filed for guardianship? Should she have risked the courts earlier? She couldn't afford a lawyer then. She couldn't afford one now. And then she remembered the box. Rosa's box, the only thing the woman had left behind, tucked into the back of the hall closet all these years. Miss Clara had never opened it because it felt like trespassing on the dead. That night, she tore it open with trembling fingers. Inside, she found old photos of Rosa as a girl, a Bible with worn pages, and a sealed envelope marked "To my son's keeper." Miss Clara broke the seal. The letter inside was written in Rosa's handwriting, dated 2 weeks before she died. She wrote of Marcus Vance, the boy she loved, a young man with a gentle heart who had wept when he learned she was pregnant. But his father, Thomas Vance, had not wept. He had raged. "He called me an animal," Rosa wrote. "He said he would throw his own son out before he let a black woman carry the Vance name into the next generation. He told me to disappear or he would make me disappear." Marcus tried to fight him, but Marcus was sick, and he had no power. "So I ran to save my baby from a grandfather who would rather see him dead than acknowledge his blood." The room went cold. Miss Clara read the line again, a grandfather who would rather see him dead. Thomas Vance had not been searching for Jordan out of love. He had spent decades denying Rosa's very existence, hiding his son's relationship from polite society. The public narrative, the grieving father who had lost his only child and now desperately sought his grandson, was a lie manufactured by a team of publicists. The truth was that Thomas Vance had built a $300 million empire on a foundation of respectability, and a mixed-race grandchild threatened the image he had curated for 50 years. But now, with his health failing and no other heirs, Jordan was his last chance to keep the company in the bloodline. This was never about family. It was about control. Armed with that letter, Miss Clara called the one person she trusted, her pastor, Reverend Elaine Douglas. By morning, the Reverend had rallied a network of community lawyers, and a young legal aid attorney named Samuel Okonkwo took the case pro bono. He filed an emergency petition challenging the removal based on the letter and on what he called egregious racial animus. The case landed on the desk of a sympathetic family court judge who granted an expedited hearing. Word leaked to local media. By that afternoon, a small crowd had gathered outside the courthouse holding signs that read, "Grandmothers are guardians," and "Keep Jordan home." The story was no longer about a poor woman and a rich man. It was about 2 million children living with grandparents and other relatives without legal protection, most of them black and brown, most of them one knock away from losing everything. But Thomas Vance's attorneys did not flinch. They subpoenaed Miss Clara's bank records, her medical history, even old complaints from a neighbor who said her house was too drafty. They painted her as a delusional old woman who had kidnapped a child from a grieving family. And then came the worst blow of all. On the eve of the hearing, Attorney Langston appeared again, this time with a settlement offer. Mr. Vance would drop all claim to custody, allow Jordan to live with Miss Clara permanently, and provide a monthly stipend of $5,000 for his care. In exchange, Miss Clara would sign a confidential settlement agreement barring her from ever speaking publicly about Rosa's letter, about the racial slurs, about the threats. She would also agree that Jordan would never be told the full truth about his grandfather. "You keep the boy, you get the money, and no one ever has to know what an evil man he really was," Langston said without a trace of irony. "Everyone wins." Miss Clara looked at the papers. She looked at the photograph of Rosa she now carried in her pocket. She thought about Jordan, about the years of sacrifice, about the lies that had already twisted this child's life before it even began. And she said no. Not because she didn't want the security, but because she could not teach Jordan to walk in truth if she sold his mother's story for a check. "You tell your client," she said, "that I will see him in court." The next morning, the courthouse was packed, every seat filled with church members, community activists, and reporters who had started calling this the Jordan case. Miss Clara walked to the front of the courtroom, holding Reverend Douglas's arm. Across the aisle, Thomas Vance sat in a wheelchair, an oxygen tube resting beneath his nose, his eyes sharp and cold. He looked nothing like the benevolent grandfather his lawyers described. The judge, a black woman with silver hair named Judge Harriet Simmons, gavelled the room to order. She had a reputation for cutting through nonsense. She looked at both parties and asked if any attempt at mediation had been made. Langston rose and smoothly mentioned the generous settlement that had been refused. The judge's eyebrow arched, and then, just as she was about to call the first witness, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A man in a gray suit entered, holding a thick envelope. He walked straight to the judge's bench and announced, in a voice that silenced the entire room, "Your Honor, I represent the estate of Marcus Vance. I have a document here that will change everything." Judge Simmons looked up, her expression unreadable. The room had gone silent, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums. The man in the gray suit identified himself as Carter Williams, the executor of Marcus Vance's estate. He had been searching for the proper recipient of a sealed document for 6 years, a document Marcus had written in the final weeks of his life, before his heart gave out. Williams held the envelope high enough for the court to see. "This is the last will and testament of Marcus Alexander Vance. Notarized, witnessed, and legally binding. It names a guardian for his unborn child." Thomas Vance's attorneys shot to their feet, objecting, arguing chain of custody, demanding authentication. Judge Simmons silenced them with a single raised hand. She ordered the document brought to the bench. The courtroom watched as she broke the seal, unfolded the pages, and read. The silence stretched, a living thing, until finally she looked up, and her eyes found Miss Clara. Marcus Vance had known about Rosa's pregnancy. He had believed the child was his. He had tried to stand against his father, but he was 25 years old, terminally ill, and legally powerless against a patriarch who controlled every asset. So Marcus did the one thing he could. He wrote a will. In it, he acknowledged the child Rosa carried as his legal heir. He explicitly disinherited his father from any claim to guardianship. And he named the one person Rosa had told him about in her letters, a woman in Chicago who had given her work, who had shown her kindness, who had a sun-shaped hole in her heart from a loss 30 years earlier. He named Miss Clara the child's legal guardian. Rosa had mailed him photos of Clara's house before she went into hiding. She had written about Clara's kindness, her steady faith, the way she talked about the son she'd lost to the system, and the promise she made to God that if she ever got another chance at motherhood, she would never let a child go. Marcus, dying with nothing left to give, signed over the only thing he had, his child's future. The courtroom erupted. Thomas Vance's face, already pale, turned the color of ash. His attorneys scrambled, but they had no ground left to stand on. The will was authentic. The executor had finally located it in a safety deposit box in New Orleans after tracking down a former assistant of Marcus's who had moved overseas. For 6 years, it had sat untouched, waiting for the right names to surface. When the news coverage of the case hit national media, the assistant saw it, contacted Williams, and the pieces that had been scattered since Rosa's death finally locked into place. Judge Simmons made her ruling right there. She vacated the temporary foster care order immediately. She recognized the will as the controlling legal instrument. She granted Miss Clara permanent legal guardianship of Jordan Vance with full parental authority. And then she looked at Thomas Vance, who sat slumped in his wheelchair, the oxygen tube whistling faintly, and she said, "This court does not look kindly on parties who attempt to weaponize the child welfare system for personal gain. You will pay all legal fees incurred by the respondent, and you will never set foot in this child's life again." Miss Clara collapsed into Reverend Douglas's arms. The church ladies wept. Samuel Okonkwo, the young attorney who had taken her case for free, stood in stunned silence. The reporters scrambled to file their stories, but the only thing that mattered was the door at the back of the courtroom, where a CPS worker led Jordan back inside. He stood there for a single heartbeat, scanning the room, searching. Then he saw Miss Clara and he ran. He ran past the lawyers, past the cameras, past the man in the wheelchair who shared his blood but not his heart. He threw himself into her arms, and she held him the way she had held him that first night in the hospital. Tight, present, like she was pouring 6 years of love and fear and prayer into a single embrace. It took 3 more months for the legal dust to settle. When it did, the Vance Family Trust, by Marcus's own directive, established a $10 million educational fund in Jordan's name, managed independently of Thomas Vance. Miss Clara finally got her air conditioner fixed. She bought new sneakers for Jordan and a decent recliner for herself, and still gave the rest of the monthly stipend to the church food pantry because she had lived lean for so long. She didn't know how to spend lavishly. The row house on that narrow street is still there. The stick figure drawings still cover Jordan's wall. On warm evenings, you can still see Miss Clara sitting on the porch, humming gospel songs, watching her grandson play stickball with the neighborhood kids. Nothing looks different from the outside, but everything has changed. Here, what the news coverage missed. In the weeks before Rosa died, she had managed to call a number she'd kept folded in her Bible for 2 years. It was the number of a woman in Chicago who had once told her, "If you ever need anything, a job, a bed, a kind word, you call me." Rosa called. She was scared, she had a newborn, she didn't know where to turn. That woman was Miss Clara. And the reason Miss Clara had been at the hospital that night, the reason she was already there when Rosa died, was not coincidence. It was a promise. Rosa had asked her to take the baby if anything happened. And Miss Clara, who had lost a child to the system 30 years before, who had prayed every night for a second chance she didn't believe would ever come, looked at Rosa's frightened face and said yes. So when the CPS investigator asked Miss Clara if she had lied at the hospital, she told the truth. She said, "I told them I was the grandmother." And then she paused, looked at Jordan playing on the floor with a toy truck, and added, "And I was right." Because family, the kind that lasts, isn't written in blood. It's written in sacrifice. And no court, no billionaire, no fleet of black cars can ever take that away. Miss Clara's story could have ended very differently. And for millions of families it does. Right now across this country, over 2.5 million children are being raised by grandparents, aunts, uncles, and family friends, most of them without any legal protection. They are loved, fed, clothed, and kept safe. But they are also one knock away from being taken. One accident, one nosy neighbor, one sudden illness, and a life built on sacrifice can be dismantled by a system that sees paperwork before it sees people. Miss Clara got lucky. A dead man's letter saved her, but most informal caregivers don't have a last will and testament hidden in a safety deposit box. They have a handshake deal, a whispered promise, and a prayer. The difference between losing a child and keeping one should not depend on whether a lawyer shows up with a miracle envelope. It should depend on what anyone who walked into that courtroom could see: a woman who would have died for that boy, and a boy who only ever knew one home. So here is the question this story leaves in your hands. Who is the Miss Clara in your life? The person raising a child that isn't theirs, stretching every dollar until it screams, doing the hardest work in the world without a title or a paycheck or a single piece of paper that says they belong there. Maybe it's your neighbor. Maybe it's someone in your church. Maybe it's you. If this story moved you, let it move you to action. Help that person find legal aid. Support organizations fighting for kinship care rights. Or just knock on their door and say, I see you. You're not invisible. Thank you for watching. If you believe that love should count as much as legal documents, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Until next time, remember, the most powerful forces in the world don't wear suits or drive black cars. They rock Barbies to sleep in creaky chairs on quiet porches, and they never, ever give up.